Welcome to the Book Bungalows and Brain Lair Books' special virtual panel discussion in honor of Octavia E. Butler's birthday today, Afrofuturism in 21st Century Black Science Fiction, with Dr. Lisa Yazek, Dr. Isaiah Lavender III, Bill Campbell, Dr. Rebecca Holden, and Tania Johnson. My name is Tanya Mills, and I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah. Southern Utah's only independent bookstore offering all new books and a full range of events. Kathy, the owner of Brain Lair Books in South Bend, Indiana, has not joined us yet, but her bookstore provides books that uplift marginalized voices, and I highly encourage you to shop from her store. I will be putting links in the chat room for both our store sites on bookshop.org. And you'll find a list of recommended Black science and speculative fiction reads by our panelists, recommended by them. Some of the books are by them on our bookshop site. We encourage you to fight the prime impulse today and instead order any of these books or others from either of our bookshop sites. And if you're local to Southern Utah, we have 3 copies of Isaiah's and Lisa's book, Literary Afrofuturism in the 21st Century, in our store. They co-edited it, and we're recording this discussion today. As soon as the video posts to our YouTube channel, you'll receive an email with the link. Please feel free to share the recording with others who might be interested. And finally, as a housekeeping note, not that it will be necessary, but let me point out that both of our store's policies forbid harassment of any kind. Anyone who posts or says anything that could be deemed as harassment will be removed from the event. Now we're going to turn the time over to Dr. Lisa Yazek, who I understand will be moderating, and I'm going to mute myself. And Kathy, if she joins us, we won't be in the picture. You're going to deal with these experts on science fiction, and particularly Black science fiction. So take it away, Lisa.
All right. Thanks so much, first of all, both to you, Tanya, and to Kathy for hosting this event. I think it's really exciting that we can all get together to celebrate Octavia Butler right now. And especially a number of us just got back from the Science Fiction Research Association conference, which was one of the biggest professional conferences in the world for this. And we spent a lot of time talking about Black science fiction. So I know at least 2 other panelists who should have a lot to say at the top of their minds right now. So, and they're smelling because they know who they are. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to have everyone on the panel introduce themselves briefly, talk a little bit about their work as is related to either the study or creation of Black science fiction. And then I have a few questions that will go around, and then I'd like to stop when we have about 15 minutes left and open, or maybe even 20 minutes, and open the floor for discussion and questions. Now, having said that, audience, please feel free to play along as we're doing this. If you have good answers to these questions, we have a chat, right? Feel free to start putting your thoughts and your ideas and even your questions in the chat. We will hopefully get a chance to talk about everything later. And if nothing else, we can always download the chat, and then we'll all have a memento of our time together. Okay, so having said that, let's go ahead, and I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about how you got interested in science fiction in general, and then maybe Black science fiction in particular. So I'm going to just go across my screen. So I'm going to ask us to go Isaiah, Tania, Rebecca, and then Bill.
All right, that works for me. Hi there, I'm Isaiah Lavender III. I'm the Sterling Goodman Professor of English at the University of Georgia after wandering around the country a little bit with various postings. Let's see, my earliest memory of science fiction is Star Wars, falling asleep during the trash compactor scene, and waking up in my father's arms way back in June of 1977. I was 3 years old. I think I write about it at several points in terms of research and reflection on my career in academia. I became interested in the study of race in American and science fiction, European, global, all over the world, probably after a moment that I had in 1983 or so when I was 9. I was a smart-mouthed kid growing up in Buffalo, New York, and I thought I had fast feet. And it was in February, and I was wearing blue moon boots, and I decided to get off and race the bus at the corner of the court I lived on, and I'd mouthed off to some 4th graders that morning, and they got off at my house, and they were waiting for me, and they circled me, started calling me the N-word, and beat me to a pulp. And I can remember having one blue moon boot coming into the house and asking my parents about the situation, and they went to the school board, and I had to ride at the front of the bus for the rest of that school year. And so my life and science fiction and race have been intertwined from various points from the beginning of my 47 years of existence, really. And so that's why I do it, and the reason I look at things about it. I don't know if you want me to talk about some of my other works, but current project is critical race theory in science fiction, and conversations with Nalo Hopkinson in the Rutledge Handbook of Alternative Futurisms, and I will pass it on to Tania.
My name is Tania D. Johnson. I write speculative fiction. I think of myself as a multimedia storyteller. So I write traditional work, but I also do multimedia in the sense of bringing music and visual art into storytelling, just to get the story off the page and reach people wherever they are. I think I started with speculative fiction, science fiction. It's always been the most interesting to me because the ideas were big enough to keep my attention. And I think for me, being, a Black woman, there's always been a dissonance between what was said and what I experienced. So Black speculative fiction, any speculative fiction, honestly, coming from a perspective that's not usually centered, always appeals to me more because I feel as if the layers are actually well represented. My latest work is 2 things: Broken Fevers, which was just came out in March. And it was published by Rosarian Publishing, which is run by Mr. Bill Campbell down there. And just released a fiction album, actually, earlier this month. And I'll hand it off to the next person.
I think that's me. Hi, I'm Rebecca Holden. I'm going to try to cover some of this. So science fiction is always, I remember always being interested in science fiction. Like a number of people in my generation, Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time was like my, oh my God, science fiction is cool moment. I also remember watching Doctor Who, the old Doctor Who with my dad many years ago. I'm older than Isaiah, so Star Wars came later for me. But it, it's something that I was always interested in science fiction. And so I always read science fiction from a very young age. I also read a lot. And when I was working on my PhD, so I actually did my PhD with Lisa. When I was working on that, I have to write a dissertation. I'm like, what's going to hold my interest? So I'm like, well, science fiction. And I was very involved in women's writing and feminist writing. So I went and started reading all the science fiction I could find by women. And this is where I started coming into Black science fiction. And this coincides with Octavia Butler's birthday. And I know we're going to come back to her later, so I won't talk a lot about that. But she really brought me into Black science fiction, was Octavia Butler, and particularly Wild Seed was the first one that I read. And my mind was blown, basically. And so for me, that was my entry into Black science fiction, which continues to be the bulk of what I write about. I also have had the opportunity to teach it to students for the last couple of years, which has also really been great and interesting for me. I teach at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm actually working on a piece on feminist cyberpunk fashion, which will hopefully be coming together. Most recently, I just finished a piece on Nalo Hopkinson for a Routledge Companion series, as well as I've got a piece in Lisa and Isaiah's book on young adult Afrofuturism, which is also really, really interesting. And I think that's about it. And I think I'm passing it off to Bill.
Hey, everybody. Bill Campbell. I'm the head cook and bottle washer of Rosarian Publishing. So while I don't know if I necessarily qualify as a science fiction writer still, I'm definitely a science fiction publisher. I guess my first experience, since we're going with that, since Isaiah did that, I think my first love of science fiction would be the original Conquest of the Planet of the Apes. So like even as a 4-year-old, I knew what the day the apes took over meant, and I loved it. Then I guess as a teenager, I really loved comic books, but I think I was pretty much interested in just writing, like, I guess, for lack of a better term, standard, more literary fiction up until college, when a sister was just like, you know, you're weird. You probably like science fiction. You know, there are these Black science fiction writers, which I didn't know. And she introduced me to Samuel R. Delany and Octavia Butler. And I was always kind of interested in politics and history and sociology and religion. So she gave me Wild Seed, and that kind of blew my mind. And I was like, oh, maybe I can do this. And then, you know, I read Chip, and then I was like, wow, this guy's smarter than I'll ever be. I want to do what he does, you know. And that's pretty much what took me down the road to where we are right now.
Yeah, Lisa, I forgot to tell half of the story. Well, I got beat up, but my mom and dad gave me the Martian Chronicles and fingered the story way in the middle of the air where all the blacks are leaving for Mars on a rocket ship, and Samuel Tease, you know, drops an M-bomb on them, right? And
Yep.
so, but they still leave, and so that was the beginning in a nutshell. Okay.
That's an amazing story. I'm glad you told the whole story. I was trying to figure out if the moon boot was the science fiction connection. I mean, it's in a marvelous image. I mean, oh my God, Isaiah, it's so heartbreaking. Now you either have to write this story, or Tanea and Bill, our artists here, are going to have to deal with it. I keep finding stories. I'm not going to write them. I keep sending them out to other artists. So no one ever takes me
I've
up.
written that story.
Yeah.
I'm
good.
My creative writing stuff is terrible, so I don't share it.
Well, oh, maybe this is what you're talking with Bill about. I don't know. Anyways, it's interesting. Like all of you, I too, like, I remember science fiction from an early age. For me, it was, and so this will place my age more like at Rebecca's, right, is Star Trek. Watching my very first memory in the world is watching original Star Trek with my parents. Reruns and eating food from our organic garden. So I was either going to be a hippie farmer or a science fiction person, right? So I'm glad I made the choice I did, and so that's cool. And and the thing is, I grew up like I seem to remember a bookshelf that literally had like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and then like Joanna Russ's The Female Man, and Sam Delaney, maybe Triton, I want to say, or something. Oh God, no, Dahlgren. Dahlgren was my first Delaney book, actually. And all these books were sort of together. And I'm sure they weren't literally together, but in my head now they are, because these are the first like things I remember reading that were speculative in nature. And it didn't occur to me, it took me a long time to learn that science fiction was not all about feminism and authors of color, because that's what I thought at first. Because I was from Judith Merrill, and then and also, like, the fact that there was supposed to be a distinction between mainstream literature and science fiction also was not really apparent to me. And I'm glad for that, because, you know, I trained as a postmodernist, and then now today I'm a science fiction studies scholar, and I love not having those distinctions in my head. I think that that's been really liberating. So that's cool. But in terms of really thinking about Black science fiction and my interest in it, I got really interested in part when Rebecca and I were in grad school, and Rebecca was like telling me about all the cool things she was reading. And then we went to Wisconsin and hung out with a very young Nalo Hopkinson, who had amazing stories about trying to write science fiction in patois and then having to flip it and write in English and insert the patois instead, because there wasn't enough technical language. I don't know if you remember that, Rebecca. It was like just this cool moment. And I'm like, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening. And then I found Sherry Thomas's Dark Matters anthologies. And I remember I grew up a cyberpunk, you know, and like I'm from Detroit. I'm about as like, you know, and I kept thinking there has to be something past the sort of cyberpunk post dystopia. And I kept calling it Newtopia in my head. I'm like, I want a Newtopia or something. And I think what I meant was Utopia in Progress. And that's where I found it. It was like in Nallow's work and in the Dark Matters anthologies. And then eventually a little book called Sunshine Patriots. Which I thought was like the most amazing answer ever to Donna Haraway, and sort of pointed out all her problems, which Bill totally didn't even probably mean, but there it was. So having conversations with people when you don't even know it necessarily. So cool. Let's just do another sort of general Black science fiction question here. And I wonder if we want to take a stab at like, what do we mean when we say Black science fiction, right? This is always the question, what do we mean by science fiction? What do we mean by Black science fiction or Afrofuturism or Black speculative fiction? And then maybe we could just give one or two like great examples of our favorite ones, get people off to start their reading and writing and viewing lists for them. And you can, any order, I don't care, anyone can talk.
Okay.
Go ahead, Bill. I go first a lot. I'm going to be quiet.
I mean, y'all are the experts. You know, it's really funny because, you know, I always, you know, well, as you guys know, I hate definitions. So I just kind of leave these things up in the open. And I know a lot of times, like in the Black comics sphere, like people just constantly have this debate on what does it mean. And I think it's just kind of hard to pin down, right? Because I think that there are definitely things even written by Black people that I wouldn't necessarily call Black science fiction. There are things that aren't written by Black people that might still be kind of Black science fiction. Like it's just kind of a, I don't know, it's like, what was that judge with pornography, you know it when you see it sort of thing? I mean, I don't know.
No, you're not wrong, Bill, because you look at it, Lisa and I were fortunate enough to have Chip write an essay for our extrapolation beyond Afrofuturism, and he entitled his essay "The Mirror Afrofuturism." And for him, Afrofuturism is any science fiction with a Black featured character, whether it's written by a white person or a Black person, because those were the parameters that Mark Derry, the white culture critic, established in his Afrofuturism essay from 1993, and so there are a lot of Black academics are against that titling because they wanted something for themselves, and so that's where you have this explosion of different names. And so when I came across Afrofuturism back in the late 90s, I was like, oh, cool term, but it's so broad, it means all kinds. I'm going to invent my own term. And so that's what I try to do in my dissertation. And, you know, but, you know, whoever coins something first is often the name for that area, and often that's the term that we stay with. And so, you know, we think, I'm trying to get beyond Afrofuturism in my own research and moving on, but it keeps pulling me back in. So I'm like writing a piece on Edgar Allan Poe's The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, compared to Matt Johnson's rewriting of it as Pym, and definitely science fiction and satire going hand in hand. And definitions, I don't know. We can play with all kinds of games with that, as you said.
I'll jump in briefly, and because that sort of follows up with Bill. What is Black science fiction? And I think I always used to say African American science fiction is a term that I would use. And I was particularly looking at then what I meant by that was science fiction written by someone who identifies as African American. So, which is different than Afrofuturism. When I started working on my Afrofuturism piece, in fact, I called Bill up and I said, Bill, help me out. And he told me that the definition thing, and I think he had a 3 thing about defining it. I don't.
Was it classify, codify, commodify, codify, kill?
Yes. So that was, and I think that that's really, really a useful, it was interesting to me. And it's certainly people have different ideas. And to me, Black science fiction isn't necessarily the same thing as Afrofuturism. Or there's African science fiction, which some people, I mean, there's so many definitions of what it is. But for me, when I was first looking into this, I was looking at science fiction written by people who identify as African American in particular. That's what I was focusing in on. But again, that's not, Black science fiction is much larger than that, right? So I can see a whole bunch of different, and people have different ways of defining it. One of the things my students this last year, they have to pick a story that they run a discussion on. And I gave them all sorts of free stuff, like what's available free that they could share with everybody. And I'm not going to remember the name of the story, and I kept desperately trying to look it up, but it was in a free download, and it was African Futurism. I don't know if you guys are probably familiar with it. Maybe you've seen it too. And I think it was nominated certainly for some awards, but I'll find it. But again, it was really a fascinating thing, but it was written by someone who would not identify right as African American, but it still was Black science fiction. So I think there's a lot of really great stuff out there. I think definitions are really interesting. In fact, that's what I start my class teaching. We talk about defining science fiction. My students have to write their own definition. And it's really fascinating when they're like, well, why does it matter? And how does this mean anything? So I think that's fascinating. In terms of favorite Black science fiction, I mean, I think we've all agreed we love Octavia Butler. And I know I already said Wild Seed is my favorite. Lisa's already mentioned Dark Matter. I would say Everfair by Niecy Shaw. My favorite Nala Hopkinson is probably still Midnight Robber. And I find that to be really, really great. I like the Broken Earth trilogy by N.K. Jemisin is really great. There's a couple of young adult things by Elia Dawn Johnson, The Summer Prince and Love is the Drug, which are both really, really great, I think. 47 by Walter Mosley. And most people don't think of him as being a young adult. That's a young adult African-American science fiction. Something I recently just read, and I have, again, so we were talking about how you read it. I read it on the Kindle, so I haven't gone back to look at it. But it's The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson, which just came out in 2020. So depending on what your reading span is like, you may have not had a chance to read it, but it's a new thing that I think is really interesting. Anyway, I just throw those out there.
If I can just say briefly about terminology. Definitions are fraught. So it's a very complicated issue that there are power dynamics at play. So depending on who you are, you're going to have a different perspective on what it is. I curate Afrofuturism story bundles, so I've tended to use that term only because it's in the zeitgeist. People know it, they identify it, it's like a brand. That's the only reason that I use it. And the last one I did, I called it Afrofuturism and the Black Fantastic. So I think the most important aspect to keep in mind is just use a term that you think is accurate for what you're looking for, and be aware that there are dynamics and politics about who's the object and who's the subject. I, for instance, personally would probably not define something that's written by a person that is not Black as Black science fiction, because then why am I not calling everything else white science fiction? So that's just me. But it's one of those things that it's charged and it's fraught, and I see absolutely why people have phrases like African science fiction or African futurism, African Judaism, but you can go down that road forever. So you just have to depend on, what your destination is.
Right. Now, I agree with you on what we should call Black science fiction. In essence, I was making that comment with respect to Delaney because he thinks Afrofuturism is a ridiculous thing, right? At the end of the day, and I can't disagree with him on that. That's why I was like, well, I want to invent my own term, right? I call it Blackgrounds in my first book, but that just doesn't, that's not catchy. It's not sexy like Afrofuturism is, right? And so that's why I admire someone like Nnedi Okorafor, who's, I want to define my own work, as we've been saying, African futurism, one word, and Afro-Jujuism as describing what she's doing. And I think that's fantastic. And artists should be able to label their own works, but Afrofuturism is a marketing category, as you're saying, Tania, right? And so same thing with most genre things. Publishers want to sell books, right, Bill?
I wouldn't know.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I want to touch, Isaiah had mentioned the essay that Chip wrote for us for a different volume we published last year called Beyond Afrofuturism. And it wasn't just that he identified some white authors as participating in it. He thought the whole darn thing was the construction of like his white friends from the 50s and 60s. It's a great essay. It's very puckish. And I think it sort of takes Derry on his own terms, and not in a rude way, but kind of seriously, and it extrapolates it back in this sort of, you know, puckish and interesting way. One thing that seems interesting and that I'm sort of getting a sense of as I talk, you know, with all of you, and also in talk I've done with other authors and artists and scholars, is I'm sort of with you, Tania, that it feels to me like Black science fiction is a sort of huge tent to talk about the production, the artistic production by people who identify as Black, whatever that means, and in a global way. Whereas Afrofuturism always feels to me much more tied to North America, and specifically maybe even the US. And Afrofuturism, I think whether you have like someone like Delaney talking about it puckishly, or DeWitt Douglas Kilgore in our book talking about it very seriously as something that white people can participate in, that Afrofuturism almost feels more like a subgenre, not a subgenre of science fiction, but a genre that, boy, I'm having a hard time articulating this here. A genre that seems to have techniques that are available for other people to use in some ways, in a way that Black science fiction is not so much about maybe a toolkit. It seems to be more focused on thinking about who produces things rather than the characteristics of the storytelling itself. I think that's where I'm trying to get
as
to.
Black folks, people are going to use our stuff whether we like it or not.
Word.
So control the discourse and make up all these great terms. That was my favorite thing when we did the Afrofuturism book, because I looked up like every synonymous term for Black science fiction. I kept getting the best ones. I think it was Black quantum. Was it Black quantum futurism? That's so totally my favorite one right now.
Yeah, that's Rashida Phillips.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And then Ronaldo with the Black speculative arts movement.
Yep.
And, yeah, you know.
Yeah. And even iterating, right? Yeah. Like,
well, I mean,
like the way
that's
he
the
iterates.
problem is like as soon as you come up with a term or a term that's placed on you, you have to like come up with something else so that they don't go to the kill mode.
You know, it's capitalism, the desire to generate the new, right? Always.
I mean, for me personally, it's more of like a method of survival. Like it was like, because as soon as they label you, you become a stationary target. Right. So you have to rename yourself so that they don't know what you're doing.
Right.
You know, that's.
Yeah, right. Well, it's the job of us scholars to try to not maybe categorize and contain, but at least to describe, and for you all to force those descriptions to keep evolving. So yeah, keep at it, please. Keep us on our toes. All right, so does anyone else have any favorite books or stories or games or films that they'd want to shout out really quickly, just while we're talking about general Black science fiction?
Well,
and then I thought we'd move on to Butler.
You know, the book that for me that was like most important starting out was Zora Neale Hurston's Moses Man of the Mountain, but I don't even know if we even talk about that.
Yep, we can. Big 10. Sure.
No, I mean, I'm just saying, I don't know if that's part of the Afrofuturism thing, canon, but I'm gonna lobby that you guys put it in there.
I always say, but no one considers that speculative, Bill. So I feel you.
Oh yeah.
Oh, but I mean, like that, like literally, that's like how Sunshine Patriots came to be. Was that
Beloved? Yeah.
I didn't
have to go back and reread.
Yeah. So
I didn't hear what you had said.
I said I always say that about Beloved, but most people don't consider that speculative.
It's totally speculative, though.
In a value judgment way, like that could never happen. I'm just saying it's not realism.
No, actually, like the first time I read it in college, like I didn't feel that way either. Then a friend of mine, like a few years later, was like, "Oh, it's a horror novel," and then I reread it, and I was like, "Oh, wow, yeah, duh."
Yeah.
Favorites in classic African American women's writing were all speculative. They just weren't being called that.
Well, you know what? That's funny.
Song of Solomon is definitely speculative, right?
Yep.
I mean, that's how I would read it now. When I first read it, that's not how I would have read it, because I don't think I had the language, right? to
Right.
talk about that.
But it clearly is, especially with the ending. I
Yeah,
mean, my
'cause he walks
goodness.
away, right,
Yeah, exactly. Which taps into a whole tradition of speculative storytelling that's been around in America since longer than Edgar Allan Poe. And this is my thing is right now I'm working with a friend of mine and we're writing sort of a people's history of American science fiction. And so we're going to start actually with Phyllis Wheatley. And so right now, Phyllis Wheatley is my favorite Black speculative author, because she's always writing about how, like, when she and her Black artist friends die, they're going to go to heaven, except they never get to heaven. They get their wings and then they all go scooting around the galaxy and like describing things and looking at things. And they are way too busy, like taking the measure of the universe to ever like worry about God. And I think that that's really fascinating. And I love the idea that a girl who was taken from her home and named after the slave ship that delivered her into slavery can then like say, basically, F you, America, I'm going to imagine the mothership and take myself out. And I think that that's really cool. So she's the first star child and the first mothership. Everyone go reread Phyllis Wheatley. There's your poetry read for this week.
Maybe that's her head.
Definitely, I would always say read Phyllis Wheatley. I mean, she's such a subversive writer, misunderstood by scholars, quite frankly, and I don't understand the scholars that thought of her in the late 20th century as, oh, she's a race traitor. Look how she's writing in the King's English at that time and manipulating these things and following. Well, she's trying to write in the language that she's learned, but you're looking at how she's making anagrams out of things in her writing. This isn't me saying this. This is Henry Louis Gates Jr. talking about this in some of his writing, and she was a rock star. She knew all of the major figures of the day, from Ben Franklin to George Washington to having Thomas Jefferson diss her in Notes on the State of Virginia, and you're just like, man, she really touched a chord with people, because here you have this young Black woman writing things and so precocious that the colonial American world took notice of her.
I didn't know that Jefferson dissed her. He went after Benjamin Banneker as well, the famous African-American scientist. Boy, he really liked to take his pot shots at like the free Blacks of his day, didn't he?
Yeah.
Wonder why.
And Sally Hemings, right?
Yeah. So, hey, but while we're talking about awesome Black women writers, why don't we turn to Octavia Butler? And I would love to hear from everyone. You like that? Was that smooth? About sort of what you think her greatest impact has been on science fiction in general, or on you in particular. And I was wondering if maybe Tania is our awesome Black woman writer here. Maybe you'd start.
Okay, that's a big one. So her impact is profound.
Yeah.
Because I really do believe she's one of the luminaries of speculative fiction across the board, from the very beginning of speculative fiction. And she made social commentary, speculative fiction, something that was palatable and enjoyable for a broader audience, I think, than anyone else has in a long time. She was a great writer on a sentence level, which for me that's the mark of a great writer, is that you waste no words and you say exactly what you mean to say in the most impactful way possible. She's obviously one of my favorite authors. Actually, before this panel, I already knew this, obviously, since I wrote it, but my undergrad thesis was on Octavia Butler. So I dug around to see if I could find it, and I had forgotten completely, this is my undergrad thesis, right? That I got her to sign it to Tania, best wishes, and write on Octavia E. Butler. So she was right, it did happen. I just think she's one of the best authors that you can spend any amount of time with. My favorite work, actually, because I write short, I enjoy her shorter work. I've read the Xenogenesis trilogies, the longer work. My favorite Octavia Butler piece, I think, is Speech Sounds. It's a very short story, but that particular collection, Bloodchild and Other Stories, like there are a lot of great, short, powerful pieces that take you through a lot of emotions at the same time. So I would recommend that one and pass it on.
I guess I'll go since I write. As I said, for me, she was just foundational. She was an inspiration. And I think it was just you know, even though I did read comics and stuff, and I wasn't really reading science fiction ever. And I think just because, you know, I'm a pseudo history nerd and like I'm into like, you know, a lot of different subjects, and I didn't really think that there was anything that I could write as a creative writer that could encompass those until I read Wild Seed. So like as soon as I read Wild Seed, it showed me like this whole, like there was this genre that had all these possibilities that could encompass like all of my myriad interests. Like I could write about politics or religion or sociology, psychology, whatever it is, or, you know, as you know, which comes later, you know, I could put satire, and that's added later with Ishmael Reed and others, but that I could put all these things in like one package. And like Wild Seed is the thing that opened that up for me. Like, oh, we can talk about like slavery and like these really horrible power dynamics, and just like all this stuff is like in this book, and which I didn't realize that you could do, because like if you're doing, you know, standard or like Delaney calls what mundane like fiction, that would all just comes off as mostly didactic, right? But in science fiction, you can just do these things in an entertaining way, and yeah, and that's what Wild Seed did for me. So every time she came to Atlanta, like I was there. You know, I mean, I was just there.
Grew up in Atlanta, Bill? Or no?
No. I just lived in Atlanta in the 90s.
Okay.
Yep, that's how I actually met Bill, through friends, when we were all here right at that sort of turn from the 90s to the aughts.
I'll go
Yeah,
ahead and follow that. Oh, sorry. I was just
good.
follow
No.
because Wild Seed is my favorite Butler as well. And I know Bill had mentioned, and that was the first Butler I read as well. And like I said, I was working on a dissertation, blew my mind. I'm like, oh my God, because I was journaling about what I was writing because I was trying to keep track of stuff. And I went back and I'm like, this was like nothing else I'd ever read before. Where is fiction like this? I was so engaged and so fascinated by the work. And like Tania, I also really, really appreciated her writing style. I really thought that it was really great and really took me into her world really quickly, like right away. I was there right away, which is also why I love the short stories too, or short stories. But for me, for example, in my dissertation, so this goes back many, many years ago, she is the only author that has a chapter just on her. All my other ones, I've got utopia, 19th century, I've got second wave feminists, I've got feminist cyberpunk, and then I have Octavia Butler. Because I think she was really, really instrumental in the science fiction world. I think Tania said this as well, speculative fiction. She was a Black science fiction writer, but she was a science fiction writer, I think, that changed a lot of what was going on in the genre. She changed a lot of what was going on in feminist science fiction, which was my interest at that point. And I think she was had a monumental effect on science fiction as a whole, as well as feminist science fiction and Black science fiction. But I think she really changed the categories quite a bit.
You're right.
Yeah,
I like everything by Octavia Butler, including Survivor, which
Yes.
it's hard to come by for lots of people. But when you have giant blue Wookiees, that's what she said. Star Wars influenced her a little bit too much in the writing, but such a great story where the mutes from the Patternmaster series, just regular humans, take rockets to escape the war between the Clayarchs and the telepaths, right? And so that's really fascinating stuff, with Wild Seed being the first book. I'll be different and say Dawn is my
that's mine.
Not that it's hard to categorize, I mean, even Fledgling was a great start, controversial for some, but magnificent. Not everything, right?
I love Dawn. I love the freaky sex in Dawn. I love teaching Dawn. Have you ever taught Dawn to freshmen? Most fun you can ever have in your life. So much fun. Like I taught it and students would come in early and they're like, Professor Yezik, I have to talk to you. And I'm like, what? And they're like, I'm really upset. And I'm like, oh no, I made a bad choice. And I'm like, they're like, I mean, I read that book and I read like the scene with like the 5 people and aliens having sex, and I was kind of turned on. Is that okay? And I was like, and I'm like, oh, bless your hearts. Absolutely. Yes. Go keep being intrigued. And I mean, I think like her ability to reach people in these surprising ways, like actually, she's a kinky writer. She brought a lot of sex into science fiction in ways that it was not here before, right? And she was very honest about this. There's an amazing anecdote in her biography about how when she was like a teenager, she found like a cache of hard like porn tapes, and that's kind of what influenced her. It's really funny, but the fact that she can get people to sort of look at things differently, I think that that's really cool. And then the other thing, right, is like she made science fiction legit. She was the first science fiction writer to get a MacArthur Genius Grant, right? And she showed people that this genre was not to be played with. And I think that that's really cool as well. I'm with you, Isaiah. Dawn's my favorite book, but in terms of short stories, I've been thinking about Childfinder a lot lately. In part because I'm putting together an anthology of women's science fiction from the 1970s. And what I'm finding is that white women and even some women who claim indigenous or Asian ancestry are often very quick in the 1970s to prove how down they are, like with these like descriptions of like the hot Black people, like traveling through their stories. And it's a little weird and uncomfortable. And then you read Childfinder, which is just a straight out race war story. And it felt so refreshing. And it's like, okay, at least one person is sort of actually addressing kind of the moment and in this really gripping and exciting way that doesn't feel uncomfortable like 50 years later, the way some of these other stories do.
Yeah.
Cool.
You know, it's interesting that you said that about the pornography. I've taught Bloodchild for the last couple of years, and the students are always like, one of my students knew my son. Was like, your mom made us read a gross story, but this year when we were online, I got more pushback.
Interesting.
From the students, like, this is pornographic. It's disgusting. How can you make us read this? And I was taught. I think some of you know Alexis Lothian, and she visits my class, and I was like, she's like, maybe it's because they were at home with their parents. And I'm like, I don't know. I didn't get that the first year when we were in person. It was just sort of like, you know, the blood and the guts and stuff like that.
Well,
but I was like, am I totally out to lunch? And of course I reread it. I'm like, okay, no, I'm not seeing what they're seeing. So I thought that was pretty interesting too.
that is. Huh. I mean, I do think sometimes online students feel more free to voice their true feelings. So I wouldn't entirely discount it, but it's also been a crazy year. I don't know what to say. And a year where people have been enclosed, and there's a lot of enclosing in that story. I've found that stories my students have historically liked that are about enclosure and being in homes, they cannot bear to read right now. So I don't know.
It reminds me of there's a bit of a Twitter conversation about trigger warnings for books, adding trigger warnings to books. So I don't know if people's sensibility, well, I won't say people, some people think that, you know, they should be warned and there's certain things that they shouldn't have to experience. So who knows? Maybe it's a trend.
Yeah. Cool. So we are at about 3:45. And so I was wondering if the audience would like to come and play with us now. If you have any questions for anyone on the panel, or if there's anything we can answer for you. I did see that Kathy had a question earlier. Kathy, I'm so glad that you could join us. And she's asking for good Afrofuturist movie recommendations. I think we could even just spread that out to Black science fiction. But movies, what are some good things if you're not a literary person? What can you watch? Besides Black Panther.
Yeah, I would call it Black science fiction, but Angela Bassett is in it, and you're doing yourself a favor there generally. Strange Days is a really interesting movie.
I love that movie.
I have that's if you're sensitive, like, let me give you a trigger warning for that. There's some things in there that are not going to be comfortable. So think about whether or not you want to see that.
Sorry to bother you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
Yes.
director out of Oakland, but Lakeith Stanfield stars in it, right? And being advertising and moving up and convincing people to give you money, all the way to taking a pill and becoming a half horse, half human, and protesting consumerism, and it's wild.
Yeah,
It'll blow your mind away. And the brother from another planet.
that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, that's a good movie. Now, and there is a movie with a white director, right? So I think that that's an interesting example there of what we're
Well, that was
talking about.
actually
Where,
the example that I was thinking of was John
Mhm.
Sayles. But John Sayles has generally been pretty good at
yeah, yes,
forgetting himself,
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
This one for Beast of the Southern Wild,
Oh,
where you
yeah.
have an actor and the
Oh,
whole
yeah.
team, they're not black, but it's
Yes.
a young black girl is the central character, a young black, family really, but
Yeah.
a great movie.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm currently watching, I just started watching Them last night, which was, I know a lot of people have been very upset with that TV show,
Mm.
but you know, I mean, it feels it feels pretty honest. So I don't, because, you know, the whole trauma porn accusation, but feels kind of honest. But then again, you know, you know, it's much later than where it's set, but, you know, I moved into a white neighborhood. So, you know, like I feel that show. Yeah, I was just trying to think, like, I was just thinking, like, oh, Eve's Bayou, but I don't even think that since you just said Beast of the Southern Wild, but I don't even think that qualifies, but that just like popped into my head. It's like, but the original Conquest of the Planet of the Apes, as I said, that was my introduction to it. And I know that it hits Mark Derry's list, but I don't know, and unfortunately, I think that that's a movie that actually feels a bit more relevant, especially after January 6th, than it probably would, you know, even last year.
Yeah.
I wanted to give a shout out to Julie Dash and Daughters of the Dust.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was thinking that too.
Like an Afrofuturist film.
Yeah.
And call me I think of The Matrix as a black film.
Really?
Right? Because Will Smith was originally supposed to be Neo.
Really? I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, he turned it. He had he thought it was going to be a dumb movie. I think he turned it down because he thought it was going to be dumb. Obviously, his wife had different feelings about that. So I had, wonderful. Someone in the chat has suggested the web series Juju, which is about Black witches. That's super cool. And then I've put 3 short films into the chat as well for you. One is by American Maya Glick, and it's called Rain, and it's a retelling of Storm the X-Man's origin story, because Maya Glick said it was annoying that white guys wrote that story and she had to redo it. And the beauty of it is she choreographs and fights through all her own fight scenes. She stars in it. She is awesome. She is such a powerhouse in it. Students love this film too. You will endear yourself to young people if you show it to them. I love Bola Ogun's The Water Phoenix. Bola Ogun is a Nigerian American director. And The Water Phoenix has such an amazing surprise twist ending, your jaw will be on the ground. It's pretty cool. And of course, at this point, I'd say Wanuri Kahia's Pumzi is kind of a classic of Black short science fiction, right? A sort of playing with dystopia and utopia and the hope for better water futures for all.
District 9, is that the name of the South
African? Yeah.
And I don't know if I call it black science fiction, but there are definitely themes in there and it's worth seeing, I think.
Maybe we're recommending ally stuff at this point too, I guess.
No.
I was going to say Monet's Dirty Computer. So,
oh yes.
So if you haven't watched that, it's and I think it's about an hour long. It's really, really interesting.
Take your pick of Missy Elliott videos, you know, she's always playing with science fiction imagery and things like that. So cool. I was also thinking, do you remember the old movie from the 1950s, The World, the Flesh, and the Devil?
No.
Oh my goodness. So it's about the end of the world, and there's a white guy, a black guy, and it's told from the black guy's perspective. And he finds a white woman and another white guy, and they got to figure it out.
Yeah, and it's Jose Ferrer and Harry Belafonte.
Yep.
And the thing that I find so funny about that movie.
And it's based on MP Shields, isn't it? Oh, go ahead.
I can't remember. But the funny thing is that, you know, because Jose Ferrer and Harry Belafonte fight over the white woman. But you know that Paul Robeson and Jose Ferrer's wife used to have a thing.
Oh, no, I didn't.
So I
Wow.
was like, talk about method acting.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, but
Wow, I did not
It
know
was
that.
based on Du Bois's The Comet.
No, it's based on M.P. Shields' The Purple Cloud. So
Okay.
another early Black science fiction story from that first half of the 20th century. Right, he was a Caribbean English Anglophone writer.
Yeah,
Cool.
no doubt.
All right. So, oh, so it's
Fast
King. Oh,
Color.
what?
Fast Color.
Oh, I don't know that one.
I haven't seen that one yet, but it's on.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, Fast Color. Sorry, I was looking
Wait.
it up while we were.
What did Spike Lee just did one? See You Yesterday, right?
I haven't
It's
seen
he
that.
didn't direct it.
But he,
I've watched that one.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting. It's got some major flaws in terms
Mhm.
of like movie narration.
Mhm.
But it's really fascinating, and it has a non-conclusive ending, which is pretty interesting, right? When you come to movies, to have this non-conclusive ending, and it's directed towards teenagers.
Yeah.
It's on Netflix, I think. I'm pretty sure that's how I saw it.
Oh, is
then
it like
there's
Raising
a-
Dion?
Yeah. I mean, there's so
What
much.
about- do you guys know the web series Send Me?
My goodness.
Yeah, there are. I was going to say, has anyone ever seen this web series Send Me? Do you know
Yes.
this at all?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Right, where they go back into the slave era for various reasons.
Yes, it's a woman,
Yeah, really
a contemporary Black woman can send other Black people back in time to antebellum America, and many people choose to go, right, for a variety of reasons. Yeah. Oh, and there's a BBC TV series I'm desperate to see called Time Wasters, which is about a contemporary Black R&B band that keeps getting thrown back in time to critical points in pop music history. And they have to negotiate the race relations in every one of those moments. And and it's a comedy. I'm desperate to see it. It sounds super fun.
Oh, I hadn't even heard of that one. Wow.
Oh, Brown Girl Begins.
Oh.
Yes, thank you, Ted. Ted in the audience reminds us that Brown Girl Begins is out there as well.
Yeah, but it's a loose adaptation. It doesn't even take you into the novel proper. It's a prequel, more or less. So it's not bad. I'm not trying to say the film is bad. It's not. It's just not the story that we know from reading Brown Girl in the Ring. Not really. At least from my perception. I did watch it. I paid for it though on some on-demand channel. So, and I mean, I have like 6 different streaming services. I might as well be paying cable, right?
Right. Okay, and we have a question from the audience from John Lewis, who asks the panelists, has anyone ever taught Kindred and had students connect with Tom Whelan? I did, and it was very, very troubling. Oh, gosh.
I think I've seen the reaction in terms connect with the character of Tom Whelan. No. but in thinking of what does slavery have to do with me as a question, I'm in the 21st century. I've had that feeling. Oh yeah, I shouldn't be held accountable for that. It has nothing. That was my ancestors, not me. I can see. I've seen students go down that path in terms of teaching Kindred.
Yeah.
I've strayed away from Kindred the novel and gone on to John Jennings's and I'm forgetting his buddy's name, but
Damien Duffy.
Damien Duffy.
Thank you. Damien Duffy's graphic adaptation of Kindred, because I've taught Kindred 1,000 times. Well, I'm not that old, but at least 24 times in 18 years. You know, just about every year Kindred comes up. And even in my 3 years at Georgia, I've done it once. So, but that had high rotation for me. So you're not. That's an interesting reaction. I bet more than people just don't want to say they identify with
That's what I was going to say. I would say, John, if you had students who were willing to admit that in the context of a class, I mean, first of all, I think kudos to you because they're saying something that I think is really weird and difficult and surprising, actually. It seems like you'd have to try to turn it into a teaching moment, right? Because what else can you do with it besides cringe in terror and run screaming? Like you sort of have two choices, right? Which is to pretend that never happened, time travel back 5 minutes, like, okay, we're going to just pretend that, but, or to really own it and run with it. And I'm curious what you did, because I don't know that I would be brave enough or have my head together enough to turn it into a teaching moment. I'm saying that now, sitting here behind my desk, like, oh, I would hope I could turn it into X.
Oh,
So yeah.
I was going to say that.
And the students shut him down. Well, you know, there's something to be said for community policing, right?
Yeah.
We have a thing called community standards. And if the students can enact it on each other, then you are running a brilliant classroom, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sorry, go Rebecca.
I was just going to say, I think what I saw the comment, I said, that's always the best option if they can do that, because I think that, and I've taught science fiction to freshmen who sort of, some of them picked it because they liked it, and some of them picked it because it fit their schedule and they had to take a version of this particular class. And a lot of them were like, wow, I didn't know that was science fiction. Or like, they were like, this idea of talking about, we talked about queer identity, we talked about all different kinds of ethnic and race identities. We looked at all their stories from different people. And some of them were like, wow, I've never seen this before. Some were like, wow, I guess I do kind of like science fiction, even though I thought it was something else. But I think that I definitely had a couple of moments in the class when I was live that I thought were really great, where the students really sort of got into it. It didn't happen on Zoom as much, but it worked really, really well. And that the students were able to say, wow, that made me uncomfortable, but that was great. You know, I really appreciated that in this classroom. So I think that that's the benefit. And this gets back to a question I think Lisa had that we didn't quite get to, is why is it important to read Black science fiction? And I think everybody should be reading Black science fiction. And why do I think that? I mean, and this gets at stuff that I've written about before. I think it's really, really important to understand. I actually thought about this because it's something from the book, from our literary Afrofuturism book. And it was a quote from Elia Down Johnson. And basically it was, she was saying, it's kind of the own voices, but we need diverse stories. We need a million mirrors of different shapes and sizes, not just so we can see ourselves, which is important, so that they can see us through our own eyes. And I think that to me, like, really encapsulates the importance of Black science fiction.
So that would be, yeah, go ahead.
No, I just think that everybody should be able to see themselves. So I don't really think of it in any other way. So, but I mean, I understand that perspective. But I think it's more important that people are able to voice their own opinions for themselves. That they're able to define themselves for themselves. But yeah, I mean, I guess I can understand that viewpoint too. You know what I mean? If that makes any sense.
Yeah, they both make sense to me. I think we
no, I mean, they do. So
see each other, but actually see each other. You get a more accurate depiction if I'm telling you about me, if I'm showing you, you know. But it depends on what your purpose is. I just think both purposes are inherently there, or can be. Yeah. And why not that? And there's an intimacy that's real.
And that gets to what Isaiah was saying about when people say, why should I even read this, right? And so depending on who they are, there are lots of different, that's what I'm saying. I think that there's different reasons for different people, but the reading it is valid in a variety of cases, right? Does that make sense? Or useful or interesting?
Yeah, it makes sense. It's like I was perverse and did a Maymester class and did pandemic fictions and had a lot of fun with the students with it, starting with a new book called The Dreamers. Let me look. Who's the author again? Oh, Karen Thompson, I think. Not a great book, but then we did Sherry Smith's Orleans, which is a black woman writer that uses Hurricane Katrina as a jumping off point, and the spread of Delta fever was pretty fantastic. And I love alternate history, and what better than Justina Ireland's Dread Nation, where the dead arise on the Civil War battlefield at the Gettysburg Address, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And you know, the laws that are enacted to make blacks and Native Americans the protectors of white high society, and that story universe, which is like, whoa, it's kind of neat, because zombies are all about viral spread.
There was a story that I looked at teaching this year called Herd Immunity by Tananarive Due. I don't know if anyone's read it. I read it and I'm like, oh, I can't make them read it. I just couldn't. It was too disheartening right now.
Well, maybe now it might be good. Like we just started playing Pandemic again, and it was actually a lot more fun than it could have been even like 4 months ago. So maybe people are ready for it.
Yeah, definitely in this September we were not ready for it.
No.
Or I wasn't ready to teach it.
No, I didn't quite catch the name of the Dew story, or
it's called Herd Immunity.
Okay. And that's in Ghost Stories, is that collection?
No, it's not. She had told me about it, and so then I went and looked it up. I think I actually was available online. I can't remember from where, but it was definitely available online.
Okay, I'll check it out. She's a great writer. The Good House is the scariest novel I've read in a long time. I just say that when my wife and I got our first mortgage on a house back in Arkansas, I was reading it at that time. I was like, oh my gosh, this is terrifying, right? And its connections to New Orleans and all that kind of thing. And okay.
So the last thing I would throw in, just while we're talking about great things, it's not just reading and watching. I want to recommend playing as well. And I would recommend go play Mike Pondsmith's Cyberpunk games and follow the saga of what's been happening, especially with Cyberpunk 2077. Pondsmith always has tried to reinvent and rethink the cyberpunk genre in a way that allows you to think about the impact of social institutions and social identities and race and class on you. And he's been talking very passionately about the relationship between cyberpunk and the Black Lives Matters movement, and how, for him, cyberpunk, and especially the games he designed, were always supposed to be a warning to not end up in that place, rather than a vision of like some cool place we want to hang out in. So I just think it's cool that we're seeing this really across genres, and that we're seeing creators really think about how to stitch together what we're talking about, that legacy of Octavia Butler, of bringing history and political relevance to science fiction in the most fun way possible. Right. The great Platonic dream to instruct and entertain all at once, perhaps.
And this,
yes.
This has been both instructive and entertaining, enlightening. And I want to thank you so much, Lisa, Isaiah, Bill, Rebecca, Tania, for sharing your time and insights with us today. Thanks to all of you who posed questions and added to the discussion. I will be providing links again, both to this recording and to the recommended books by the panelists in a follow-up email. And there's so much in the chat that I will try and share that as well in the email. Again, it was a pleasure. The best to all of you. Goodbye, and stay safe and stay well.
Thank you.
You are, Kathy. Did you want to say one thing? Go ahead, Kathy.
No, this was just wonderful. I'm glad I made it in time to hear most of the conversation. That was just so much fun. I have an entire list of things I have to now go watch. So sad for my bookstore because I'll be watching movies. But just thank you all for taking the time to do this with us. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for supporting us.
Maurice
What'd you
Gross's
say?
Pimp My Airship. Fantastic black cyberpunk, and not cyberpunk, steampunk novel. Great stuff. Indiana writer, I believe, which is good stuff. Right. I'll end there. There's so many.
Which is surprising coming from Indiana. As an Indiana bookstore, it's not surprising, but I will find that because I
could be wrong.
No, he's in Indianapolis.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
How exciting.
Yes, it is.
Sorry, I like looking at my bookshelves. That's why I do all this Zooming from my office whenever possible.
Well, have a great day, all of you.
All right, everyone.
so
Thank you
much.
again so
Thank
much.
you.
It's great
Guys.
seeing everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye.